The rain started falling on Saturday morning, matching the gray mood that had settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. He had been awake since 4 a.m., staring at the ceiling and listening to his upstairs neighbor getting ready for work. The sound of someone else having a routine, a place to go, a purpose for their day, had become a torture that Marcus couldn't escape. It was day 7 since receiving the eviction notice. 3 days remained before Mrs. Chun would begin formal proceedings to remove him from the apartment. Marcus had spent the week applying for every job he could find, including positions that paid a fraction of his former salary. But the responses had been uniformly disappointing. Either the positions had already been filled, or his qualifications were deemed overqualified for entry-level work. The irony of being too qualified for jobs he desperately needed wasn't lost on Marcus. He had even tried removing his college degree and management experience from his resume, creating a simplified version that made him appear less threatening to potential employers. But the gaps in employment were still there, and the questions about why someone his age was seeking entry-level work still came up in interviews. Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee, the cheapest brand he could find at the dollar store. The taste was bitter and weak, but caffeine was caffeine, and he needed something to help him think clearly about his rapidly dwindling options. The classified ads were spread out in front of him, but he had already circled every possibility twice. His phone had been buzzing all morning with calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Bill collectors, he assumed, though he had stopped answering unknown numbers weeks ago. The voicemail messages were always the same: demands for payment, threats of legal action, offers to set up payment plans that he couldn't afford anyway. Around 10 a.m., Marcus heard a knock at his door that was different from Mrs. Chin's businesslike rap. This knock was softer, more hesitant. When he looked through the peephole, he saw Emma standing in the hallway, holding an umbrella and looking around nervously. Marcus's heart jumped with panic. Emma wasn't supposed to be there. It was Saturday morning, and she should have been at home with Jennifer, probably getting ready for soccer practice or hanging out with friends. The fact that she was standing outside his apartment meant something had gone wrong, or worse, that she had figured out just how bad his situation had become. He opened the door quickly, ushering her inside before any neighbors could see her. "Emma, sweetheart, what are you doing here? Does your mother know where you are?" Emma set down her umbrella and looked around the sparse apartment with curious eyes. She had only been there once before, shortly after he had moved in, and Marcus had made sure to clean thoroughly and hide any evidence of his financial struggles. Now the apartment looked exactly like what it was, the home of someone who was barely getting by. "Mom thinks I'm at soccer practice, but it got canceled because of the rain," Emma said, settling onto his couch. "I took the bus here because I wanted to talk to you about something." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Emma taking public transportation across the city to see him suggested a level of determination that meant she wasn't going to accept casual answers to whatever questions she had come to ask. "Emma, you shouldn't be riding the bus alone. It's not safe, and your mother is going to be worried sick when she finds out," Marcus said, trying to inject some parental authority into his voice while simultaneously wondering how he was going to explain this to Jennifer. "Dad, I'm 14, not 4. I can handle a bus ride," Emma replied with the casual confidence of a teenager who believed herself more capable than her parents gave her credit for. "Besides, we need to talk, and you've been avoiding Mom's calls. She's worried about you." Marcus sat down across from his daughter, studying her face and trying to gauge how much she actually knew about his situation. Emma had always been perceptive, even as a small child, and 14 years of being his daughter had taught her to read his moods and expressions better than most adults could. "I haven't been avoiding anyone. I've just been busy with job interviews and following up on applications," Marcus said, repeating the same explanation he had been giving everyone for months. Emma fixed him with a look that was far too mature for her age. "Dad, I heard Mom on the phone with Grandma last week. I know you lost your job, and I know you haven't been paying alimony. I also know that you moved to this apartment because you couldn't afford the house anymore." The directness of her statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had worked so hard to shield Emma from the reality of his situation, to maintain the illusion that he was still the capable, successful father she had always known. Hearing her recite the facts of his failure in her matter-of-fact teenage voice was devastating. Emma, adult financial situations are complicated. You don't need to worry about things like that, Marcus said weakly, knowing even as he spoke that the words sounded hollow. I'm not worrying. I'm trying to understand, Emma replied. You used to call me every other day, and now sometimes I don't hear from you for a week. When we do talk, you sound different. Sad, I guess. And yesterday Mom got another call from your landlord. Marcus felt his face go hot with embarrassment. The fact that Mrs. Chun was calling Jennifer meant his problems were officially becoming everyone else's problems. It also meant that his carefully maintained facade of having everything under control had completely crumbled. What did the landlord want? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Something about rent money and legal notices, Emma said. Mom got really upset after the call. She started crying, which scared me because Mom never cries. That's when I decided I needed to come see you myself and find out what's really going on. Marcus looked at his daughter sitting on his second-hand couch in his tiny apartment, her wet hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing the soccer uniform she wouldn't get to use because practice had been canceled. She looked so young and yet so determined, and he realized that his efforts to protect her from his problems had instead made her feel excluded and frightened. Emma, I've been having some challenges finding the right job, Marcus said carefully. The economy is tough right now, and companies are being very selective about who they hire. But I'm working hard to figure everything out. Dad, you can just tell me the truth, Emma said with a slight edge of frustration in her voice. I'm not a little kid anymore. I can handle knowing that things are bad. What I can't handle is feeling like you don't trust me enough to be honest with me. The rain was getting heavier outside, drumming against the windows of the apartment and creating a cocoon of sound around their conversation. Marcus realized that Emma had inherited his own tendency to want clear, straightforward information rather than comfortable lies. You're right, Marcus said after a long pause. I lost my job 6 months ago when the company restructured. I've been looking for work since then, but it's been much harder than I expected. I'm behind on rent, behind on bills, and I haven't been able to keep up with the support payments for you and your mother. Emma nodded as if she had suspected as much. How bad is it? Marcus hesitated, then decided that if he was going to be honest, he might as well be completely honest. Pretty bad. I have 3 days before I get evicted from this apartment, and I don't have anywhere else to go. I've applied for hundreds of jobs, but nobody seems to want to hire me. What about Uncle Mike? Or your friend Tom from your old job? Can't they help you find something? Marcus smiled sadly at his daughter's faith in the power of networking and personal connections. I've tried, sweetheart. Uncle Mike's company isn't hiring, and Tom lost his job too when our company downsized. A lot of people are struggling right now. Emma was quiet for a few minutes, processing this information. Marcus watched her face, seeing the wheels turning as she tried to understand how someone she had always seen as competent and reliable could end up in such a desperate situation. Are you going to be homeless? Emma asked quietly. The question hung in the air between them, stark and frightening in its simplicity. Marcus had been avoiding thinking about it in exactly those terms, but homeless was precisely what he was going to be in 3 days if something didn't change dramatically. I don't know, Marcus admitted. I'm still trying to figure out my options. Emma stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain falling on the street below. When I was little, you used to tell me that there was always a solution to every problem if you just worked hard enough to find it. Do you still believe that? Marcus joined her at the window, putting his arm around her shoulders. I used to believe that completely. These past few months have taught me that sometimes there are problems bigger than what one person can solve alone. But you're not alone, Emma said, leaning against him. You have me, and you have Mom, even if you two aren't married anymore. And you have people who care about you. Marcus felt tears starting to form in his eyes. His 14-year-old daughter was trying to comfort him, trying to remind him of resources he had been too proud or too ashamed to consider. The role reversal felt wrong, but her words also felt like the first genuine hope he had experienced in weeks. Emma, I appreciate that, but these are adult problems that require adult solutions, Marcus said. You shouldn't have to worry about taking care of me. That's my job with you, not the other way around. Maybe taking care of each other isn't just about money, Emma replied. Maybe it's also about being honest with each other and not trying to handle everything alone. They stood together at the window for a while, watching people hurry down the street under umbrellas and raincoats. Marcus realized that Emma was right about his isolation being part of the problem. He had been so focused on maintaining his dignity and independence that he had cut himself off from the people who might actually want to help him. "Dad, can I ask you something else?" Emma said. "Of course. When you think about the future, what do you see?" Marcus considered the question carefully. For months, when he thought about the future at all, he saw only a series of increasingly desperate scenarios. Homelessness, bankruptcy, the complete destruction of everything he had built in his adult life. "I used to see myself getting back on track, finding a good job, being able to provide for you properly again," Marcus said. "Lately, I have trouble seeing much of anything positive." Emma turned to face him directly. "I don't need you to provide for me the same way you used to. I need you to be my dad. That doesn't require money." The simplicity and wisdom of her statement hit Marcus harder than any rejection letter or eviction notice had. He had been so focused on his role as a provider that he had almost forgotten his more important role as Emma's father. That relationship didn't depend on his employment status or his bank account balance. "When did you get so smart?" Marcus asked, managing a genuine smile for the first time in weeks. "I had a pretty good teacher," Emma replied, smiling back at him. "He taught me that giving up isn't an option, even when things look impossible." As they continued talking, Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not hope, exactly, but a different way of thinking about his situation. Emma's visit had reminded him that his life had value beyond his ability to earn money, and that the people who mattered most to him were more concerned about his well-being than his financial status. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the small apartment, Marcus Thompson began to remember who he was beyond his job title and his bank account balance. And for the first time in months, that felt like enough to build on. Marcus Thompson sat on the cold metal bench outside the unemployment office, staring at the rejection letter in his trembling hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the crushing reality of his situation. At 42 years old, he had gone from being a respected regional manager at a Fortune 500 company to just another statistic in the growing pile of unemployed professionals. The morning had started like every other morning for the past 6 months. Marcus had woken up in his cramped studio apartment, the same apartment he had been forced to move into after losing his house. The walls were thin, and he could hear his neighbors arguing about money, a sound that had become all too familiar. He had put on his best suit, the one that still looked professional despite being worn too many times, and headed out to another job interview. This particular interview had seemed promising. The company was smaller than his previous employer, but the position matched his experience perfectly. He had researched the company thoroughly, prepared answers to every possible question, and arrived 15 minutes early as he always did. The receptionist had smiled politely and asked him to wait in the lobby, where he sat among other candidates, all wearing similar expressions of hope mixed with desperation. When his name was called, Marcus had followed the hiring manager into a conference room with large windows overlooking the city. The interviewer, a woman in her 30s named Sarah, had seemed genuinely interested in his background. She asked thoughtful questions about his previous role, his management style, and his vision for the department he would potentially lead. For 45 minutes, Marcus had felt like his old self again. He spoke confidently about his achievements, the teams he had built, and the processes he had improved. He could see Sarah taking notes, nodding approvingly at his responses. When she mentioned the company culture and growth opportunities, Marcus had allowed himself to imagine having a purpose again, having somewhere to go each morning, having colleagues to collaborate with. But then came the question that always came, the one that made his stomach drop every single time. "While your qualifications are impressive, we have decided to move forward with another candidate whose experience more closely aligns with our current needs." The words blurred together as Marcus read them for the third time, each reading making them feel more final. Sitting on that bench, Marcus thought about the phone call he would have to make to his ex-wife Jennifer. She had been patient about the alimony payments when he first lost his job, but patience had turned to frustration, and frustration had become anger. Their daughter Emma was starting high school in the fall, and the expenses seemed to multiply every month. private school tuition, soccer fees, the laptop she needed for her advanced placement classes. All the things that Marcus had once provided without a second thought now felt like insurmountable mountains. The worst part was disappointing Emma. She still called him every Sunday, her voice bright and cheerful as she told him about her week. She never asked why he couldn't attend her soccer games anymore, or why their dinner dates had moved from nice restaurants to fast food places. At 14, she was old enough to understand that something had changed, but young enough to still believe her father could fix anything. Marcus folded the rejection letter and put it in his jacket pocket, where it joined 4 others from the past 2 weeks. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, looking at names of former colleagues who had once called him for advice, for favors, for recommendations. Most of them had stopped returning his calls months ago. The few who still took his calls offered sympathy, but no real help. The business world had moved on without him, and he was beginning to wonder if he would ever find his way back into it. The bench was getting uncomfortable, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to leave. Going back to his apartment meant facing the stack of bills on his kitchen table, the eviction notice that had been posted on his door yesterday, and the crushing silence of having nowhere to be and nothing productive to do. He had applied for unemployment benefits, but the bureaucratic process moved slowly, and the amount would barely cover his rent, let alone everything else. He watched people walking by, most of them moving with purpose and urgency. They had places to be, meetings to attend, deadlines to meet. Marcus envied their sense of direction, their obvious belonging in the world of the employed. He remembered when he had walked with that same confidence, when his days had been filled with decisions that mattered, problems that needed solving, teams that looked to him for guidance. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was sitting outside the unemployment office in the business district where he had once worked. His old building was just 3 blocks away, a gleaming tower of glass and steel where he had spent 12 years climbing the corporate ladder. He had been good at his job, maybe even great at it. His team had consistently exceeded their targets, and he had received positive reviews every year until the very end. But none of that mattered when the company decided to cut costs. He had been called into a conference room on a Tuesday morning, along with 47 other managers across various departments. The human resources director had delivered the news with practiced efficiency, explaining the severance package and the timeline for their departure. They had been given 2 weeks to wrap up their projects and say goodbye to their teams. Marcus had tried to maintain his dignity during those final 2 weeks, helping his team members understand the transition, ensuring his projects were properly documented for whoever would take them over. But the humiliation was constant. Colleagues who had once sought his opinion now avoided eye contact in the hallways. Meetings were scheduled without him. His access to certain systems was gradually revoked as his departure date approached. The day he cleaned out his office had been particularly painful. 12 years of work reduced to 2 cardboard boxes, family photos, a few books, some personal items from his desk. The awards on his wall, recognizing his achievements and contributions to the company, had stayed behind. They belonged to a version of himself that no longer existed. Marcus shifted on the bench and checked his phone. It was 3:47 p.m., which meant Emma would be getting out of school soon. She would probably text him later, asking about his day, and he would lie as he had been lying for months. He would tell her that things were going well, that he was meeting with some interesting companies, that something good was bound to happen soon. The lying was almost worse than the unemployment itself. Marcus had always prided himself on his honesty, especially with Emma. Even during the divorce, he had tried to be truthful with her about the changes in their family without overwhelming her with adult problems. But how could he explain that her father, who had once seemed so capable and successful, was now a failure who couldn't even get a job interview that led to anything meaningful? A group of young professionals walked by, laughing about something one of them had said. They looked fresh and optimistic, probably not much older than Emma. Marcus wondered if they knew how quickly everything could change, how fast a successful career could become a distant memory. 6 months ago, he might have been having lunch with his own team, discussing quarterly projections and strategic initiatives. Now he was a spectator to a life he used to live. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the plaza where the bench sat. Most of the foot traffic had slowed down as people headed home from work, Another reminder of the rhythm of employed life that Marcus no longer participated in. He knew he should get up and go home, maybe stop at the grocery store to buy something cheap for dinner, maybe spend the evening updating his resume for the 100th time. But movement required energy, and energy required hope, and hope was in dangerously short supply. Marcus had always been a problem solver, someone who approached challenges with determination and strategic thinking. But this problem felt too big, too complex, too deeply personal to solve with the skills that had once made him successful. He thought about his father, who had worked at the same factory for 38 years before retiring with a pension and a gold watch. Job security had been different in his father's generation. People expected to work for the same company their entire careers, to build relationships that lasted decades, to retire with dignity and financial stability. That world felt as distant as ancient history now. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, his heart jumped, hoping it might be a response to one of the applications he had submitted. But it was just a notification from his bank, informing him that his account balance had fallen below the minimum threshold. Another small humiliation in a series that seemed endless. The bench was getting cold, and the business district was emptying out as evening approached. Marcus knew he couldn't sit there forever, but he also couldn't imagine where else he belonged. Home didn't feel like home when it was just a place to hide from the world. The library was an option. It was warm and quiet, and he could pretend to be researching job opportunities while actually just trying to fill the empty hours until bedtime. As he finally stood up from the bench, Marcus felt the weight of the rejection letters in his pocket, the heaviness of his phone with its silent notifications, and ignored calls from bill collectors. He had always believed that hard work and determination could overcome any obstacle, but unemployment had taught him that some obstacles were bigger than individual effort. Some problems required more than just wanting to solve them. Walking slowly toward the subway station, Marcus wondered how much longer he could keep pretending that everything would work out. The savings account was almost empty, the credit cards were maxed out, and the bills kept coming regardless of his ability to pay them. Emma still believed in him, but even her faith might not survive much longer if he couldn't find a way to turn things around. The rejection letter crinkled in his pocket as he walked, a paper reminder of dreams deferred and opportunities lost. Tomorrow he would get up and try again, sending out more applications, making more phone calls, preparing for more interviews that might lead nowhere. But tonight, Marcus Thompson sat with the growing fear that trying might not be enough anymore. Sometimes the darkest moments in our lives become the doorway to our greatest transformations. What happens when a successful man loses everything he thought defined him? When the weight of failure becomes so heavy that giving up seems like the only option? This is the story of Marcus Thompson, a man who discovered that sometimes our lowest point becomes the foundation for our highest purpose. It's a reminder that hope often comes in the smallest packages, and that a single moment of human connection can rewrite the entire story of our lives. Prepare to witness how one little girl's simple act of kindness became the catalyst that pulled a broken man back from the edge and transformed him into someone he never imagined he could become.